Good morning. Thank you. Well, I want to dive in right away this morning to, this is like the fifth week of looking at neighboring and what it means to be a neighbor. And in particular, we've been looking and thinking through really something that Jesus says a number of times. The first part won't surprise us. The second part, well, we kind of take it. Well, was he as serious about the second part as he was the first part? But a number of times you see Jesus say this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And here's the second part: love your neighbor as yourself. But to Jesus, it wasn't two parts. He was really the first person to come along and say, those are not separable. If you don't love your neighbor, if you're not interested, if there isn't a wave of compassion for them that comes over to you, and that's not just the people who live beside you, it is them, but it's people who work with us and our family and people beyond that. If there isn't a sense of love for them, you gotta check your love for God, whether that's in place. Jesus tied these together, the vertical love for himself and love for people. He said, love God. And we would, like, as followers of Jesus or followers of God, we would all go, of course. That's like non-optional. But the second part feels optional. But it wasn't to Jesus. It wasn't. And so we've been thinking through these last weeks about what exactly does it mean to be a neighbor with neighbor love. And this morning, I want to take a bit of a different tack with it and not so much think about us engaging our individual neighbors or people at work, but how do we, as followers of Jesus, live in a culture that doesn't follow Jesus, where values collide? You even see it in the drama, like a view of heaven or a view of death. So how do we handle those differences when there's actual skepticism and even fear of what we as followers of Jesus might hold as key values to us? So here's the question. I'm going to simplify it. I want to look together at this question: how do we, as followers of Christ, engage our culture? Now, today's a little different. I'm not going to give you a lot of answers to that, but I want to send you home or together as a family to ask the question together. How do we do this? If we're followers of Christ, how do we do it? In other words, as followers of Jesus, our values are going to be a little different, probably to some degree, and sometimes vastly different than our culture. See, as followers of Jesus, we love the truth. We love to tell the truth, even at great expense to ourselves. We love truth. We steer away from lying and saying things about other people that aren't true and aren't complimentary. We think fidelity in marriage is more than some vows, that it happens in our hearts and our souls to one another, the person that we're married to, exclusively so. We don't deride and demean other people who disagree with us. We refrain from gossip, and we deal with anger, because it's real, in constructive kinds of ways. Now, do we do that perfectly? No. But we would subscribe to the school of Jesus who teaches those things and go, those are our values. And that's how we want to, by God's grace, increasingly live, because we're increasingly thinking like Jesus. So what do you do if you believe that and desire to live that, but live in a culture that doesn't desire that and has a different set of values? They will eventually collide, right? They will. So how then do we engage a culture when that happens? Now, this is not a new question for followers of Jesus. It's as long as there have been followers of Jesus, this question has been attempted to be handled and dealt with, because every generation has had to do it. Human history is a picture for us of just how Jesus followers have over the years tried to handle this and deal with it, and it's actually pretty predictable. You've heard of the fight or flight sense? It kind of applies to this as well. There are a lot of really smart people these days who are thinking about this and writing about this, because it seems in our culture the sense of vibrancy within the Christian faith, or the church as a whole, the Church of Jesus as a whole, is waning, and it doesn't have quite the influence that it did. And there's a lot of writing, really smart people, Tim Keller and Don Carson and some other books that are written, and some of their thoughts are part of my thoughts this morning. So how do we engage our culture? Historically, this is an oversimplification, but historically there have been two ways that we have tried to engage or deal with a culture that has values different than followers of Jesus Christ. One is to withdraw, to kind of remove ourselves, to be in the world but not of it, and try to figure out how to do that. And there are probably two approaches. One is a more conservative approach, the other might be a little more liberal. The conservative approach would say, well, the world really isn't ours to fix. No, we're not here to mend the world. The world is going to be as it is. It's influenced by a variety of factors, among them our enemy and selfishness and so on. And by nature, it's just opposed to God and the things of God. And the closer we get to it, the greater chance we get contaminated by it. So it's not ours to fix. Let's withdraw from it. And when that happens, we tend to build up the church. We evangelize the culture. We do something, but we're building up the church is what we're trying to do with it. The more liberal view of it would be this: why bother? Why bother to be involved? It can't be repaired anyways. Besides, traditional Christianity is so out of touch and irrelevant, it's about time it gets up to speed with the things of the culture. Traditional views such as involving sexual orientation and abortion and women's rights. The answer is, this is 2018. The church, the Christian faith, needs to get up to speed on where the culture is. And so the church kind of withdraws because it's a why bother. Besides, God has said that he's going to judge it in time, and it's up to him to do that. Why should we do that? Let's just let things play out as they are. There's the withdraw idea. The second idea is to try to overcome culture. And again, there's a conservative and a liberal approach to this. The first of the overcome, maybe a conservative approach, is to transform it, but in more of a triumphalistic kind of way, to take power and to make society the way that it should be, to move into places of politics and government and academics and business and media, to shift it from that place of power and authority. And so we try to transform it. The second, maybe more liberal view, is we try to liberate it. We engage it. This is kind of, you've heard of liberation theology or liberation theology or the philosophy. It's to build up the social structures within the culture, to deal with the greed and self-centeredness of the culture so that the marginalized folks in our culture are actually taken care of. And so we engage in social structures to provide for people that aren't cared for otherwise, and thereby transforming or liberating culture from where it is. So it's oversimplification, I know, but those are the two things through course of history over the last 2,000 years as to way Christians have tried to engage or disengage their culture: withdraw and overcome. So when Jesus says for us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, what is he saying as it relates to us engaging our culture? When Jesus says love our neighbors and our collective neighbors and ourselves, we all make up the culture. So how would Jesus suggest that we engage? Would he say withdraw? Would he say overcome? I want to suggest that I think Jesus has a third way. That isn't withdraw, and it isn't trying to overcome. We see a glimpse of this in one of Jesus' first public addresses that he makes. It's such a popular address, in fact, that we've given it a name, the Sermon on the Mount. And it happens early on, as Matthew recalls it, in his eyewitness account of Jesus' life. He barely gets into the 5th chapter of his account of Jesus' life, and he says, on that occasion, as Jesus was gathered with a group of people, He turned to this unlikely group of people, ordinary citizens, ordinary people in the culture, not the elite, not the wealthy, not the power brokers, just ordinary people. And he turns to them in Matthew 5:13. He says this to them: "You are the salt of the earth." That's who you are. That's not who you're going to become. That's who you are. But what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It'll be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. Second thing he says to them: "You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father." So let's talk salt and light for just a second in the first century. Salt had two primary purposes. This won't be new to you if you've looked at this passage before. Two primary purposes. One was a preservative to keep food from spoiling, and the second was a flavor enhancer. There was actually a third use, that was to kill snails and slugs, but why talk about that one, right? So a preservative and a flavor enhancer. So you got to imagine a piece of beef, if you will, that's freshly cut. It's going to spoil quickly unless there's a way to preserve it. And so what was done is it was wrapped in salt. If you just took a block of salt and put it beside the meat, it wasn't going to do a thing. If you put the block of salt on top of it, it wasn't going to do much. No, salt needed to be separated from other salt and worked into the meat so that it would be preserved, to remove the moisture and preserve it. This is how salt worked. What Jesus is telling those people around him, these unlikely people actually, is that in God's kingdom, when God sets things up the way God wants them set up, and there are people who want to be in God's kingdom where God gets his way, they become preservatives and flavor enhancers in the culture. That's what they become. They don't try to become that. That's what they become. Because they're followers. They're growing in their knowledge and love for God, of how he does things. And that begins to take over their thinking. And without trying, really, that's who they actually become. The light part. Well, light is meant to illuminate, to reveal. It's kind of a wayfinder. The imagery probably that would have crossed the people's minds who hear this, at least some of them, would have been to think of Jerusalem, which was built on top of and on the side of a hill, and it was considered in all of Israel the brightest of all cities. It was the place where God's presence was, right, for the Jewish people. And Temple Mount was right at the top, and they spared no expense to put out torches and lights, and so you could see the city from a distance. And it showed you where Jerusalem was. It showed you where God was. It showed you how to get there, especially at night when it was particularly dangerous to be out in the countryside. And this is what probably is going through their minds, that people who live in God's kingdom with God, they show the way. They illuminate. What, to themselves? No, by virtue of being in the kingdom with God, they light the way to him. They illuminate the path to God for other people. So Jesus says to those gathered around him, preserve and flavor the culture and illuminate the culture to the direction of God. Okay, so is there a question that comes to your mind? There's one that comes to my mind. Can't you do that by withdrawing? Can't you do that by overcoming the culture? Does there need to be a different way? Is Jesus really pointing to a different way? Could you not just withdraw from it, build a beautiful self-enclosed community that would be the envy of the world, and everyone would look at that community and go, we want to be like them. They're not like us. They've withdrawn. We want to be like them. I suppose you could. Could you not overcome the culture of the day by taking the values and the potency of light and the preservative of salt and the flavor enhancing salt kind of characteristics and just invade the culture and see the culture turn around and change to the values of Christians? I suppose you could. And those may be meritorious and there may be some value to them, but I don't think that's what Jesus is driving at in this passage when he's trying to help the people who are there answer the question, how do we engage in a culture? In a way, what Jesus, I think, is pointing at is something that's a bit analogous to the gospel itself, the good news of Jesus, of why he came into the world. Trevor did such a great job last week kind of summarizing that. Check it out. Last week was fantastic information for us. I want to try to summarize it even more. God created a beautiful world with beautiful people that were the object of his love. Those beautiful people didn't want to do life with God. They wanted to do it themselves. They wanted to have their own God in their own way. And when they did, they disconnected themselves from God. And they knew that something was wrong because people kept dying around them and disease was now part of their world and things were broken and they knew it was broken and they knew somehow there must be a reconnection with God who made it all. And so they tried a couple of methods and tried for thousands of years these two methods. One of them was, let's earn our way back. Let's be well-behaved people. Let's do the things that we think God wants us to do or he communicates through his prophets and priests and kings. Let's be that kind of person. Let's, by our effort, get reconnected to God. The second was, let's find a different God. Let's just see if we can't find some other way, some other method. And most times that other God became ourselves. And so these two methods were tried and both of them failed abysmally. Never recreated that connection to God. And so God, in his grace and his goodness, took matters into his own hands and said, I will fix a problem humans can't fix. And he came into this world in the form of a human being who we also rejected. But he was not to be dissuaded from what he came for. He gives his life for us on a cross, dies, comes back to life again and says, if you'll but put your faith and your trust and the weight of your life in me and what I've done, if you'll but believe that and receive it, you will be reconnected. You'll be spiritually alive with me. And now you can grow in your knowledge and awareness of me, and I will increasingly form my nature in you. That's the good news, simplified, of what Jesus has done. You see, it wasn't earning, and it wasn't finding an alternative. God found a third way, a different way, his unique God kind of way to impact the world. And here's the thing. When that way impacts our lives in real kinds of daily terms, it takes a fresh look at what being salt and light in this world really means. It's kind of a third way that flows out of people who embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to try to explain that. When we are deeply and personally impacted by the power of Jesus' death and resurrection, our engagement in the culture is neither to withdraw nor to overcome or overtake the culture. Here's the third way I think Jesus might be driving at, and that would be to be a faithful, humble presence within the culture. A faithful, humble presence within the culture. If I go back to the salt metaphor for just a second, to preserve and to enhance in a way that's informed by this gospel at work in our lives. It might mean many more things than this, but here's one thing that came to my mind this week as I was thinking about it. It means that we have the humility to appreciate the contributions of people who have not experienced the mercy and forgiveness of grace that we have. And we do it because we have. Can I say that again? To be salt, to preserve, to enhance the flavor, means that we have the humility to appreciate the contribution of people who don't know and love Jesus. But they make a contribution and we appreciate it and we can see the value of it and we express it in a way that reminds them that they have a value to him. In other words, we give away the grace that we've received and God intended us to have, just like he gave it to us before we even trusted him. You see, our tendency is to minimize and even hold at arm's length, largely out of fear, the contributions of people and organizations that are secular in nature. I recall several years ago when I told a pastor friend in another state that we were actively engaging in a friendship and a relationship with our city. He cautioned me in such strong terms. He says, you have to be so careful with that. We would never do that. because we only associate ourselves with people who have Jesus Christ at the center of what they do. And I think back of the beautiful relationship we have with our city and how God has used that to benefit this community in wonderful, wonderful ways. I think we have to have the humility to be able to engage with people and organizations that aren't overtly Christ-centered. I think we end up preserving the culture, and we end up being an enhancement to the culture. I find something a bit ironic. I don't know if you find this ironic or not. I do. Some of us, maybe many of us, I'm not really sure, stop before most of our meals and we thank God for the food that He's given us. Many of you might do that. Yet seldom has this ever, I can't think of a time actually, where this has ever happened to me, that as I did that with an empty plate in front of me, God actually came and supernaturally just filled my plate with food. It came from someplace. And in most cases, it came through the hands of people who don't know Him or may know Him marginally or aren't interested in Him. Farmers and processors and truck drivers and shelf stockers and cashiers. And He answers our prayer of thankfulness for food through people who don't know Him. Is that ironic? Because He values what they do. He values them. He values their contribution. And we too can not withdraw and not try to overtake, but be part of a culture and recognize the amazing contribution that people make to our world. So, to be faithful, humble presence within our culture by being salt is to be profoundly grateful and appreciative of the work done by people. Your pool guy and your bug guy, your landscaper, your doctor, your dentist, your therapist, the cashier, the store clerk, the mail delivery person, the FedEx driver, the lawn care guy, the mechanic. You know, we can be so exacting and so demanding for perfection and the best of the people who serve us that we actually come across self-righteously and not a flavor enhancer in their world. Love God. Love the pool guy. Love God. Love your hosts at dinner or lunch today. Love God. Love the person who delivers your mail. Those are together, and I think that's a little bit of what faithful, humble presence within our culture looks like. So, light of the world, illuminate, direct, guide people to the good God that we have. Here would be another way. This gospel-directed third way is also to have the courage to inspire and even humbly and graciously provoke our culture to a better way. I read this account in a first century letter this last week. It's a fascinating letter. If you like history and first century history, you might like this letter. I'll refer you to it a little later. But as the story goes in this letter, a man got into some kind of financial trouble in his home country. And he got in debt to someone, and he couldn't pay that debt back. And in his culture of the first century, the way that it worked, the way the debt got paid back, if you couldn't pay it back, was you became a slave of that person, an indentured slave. Not like the racial slavery that we've struggled with in our country and still in other parts of the world struggle with. You worked for the person till you paid it off, but it was also pretty cruel and mean at times as well. And so this person realizes it probably is going to take like a really long time, if ever, that I can pay this off. What if I just skip out? So he skips out and goes to another country, a couple of countries away to the west, and there he makes his new home. And as God would have it for him, it's an amazing story, really. We don't know how exactly it happened, but he comes across someone who knows and loves Jesus, builds a friendship with him, and through the course of time, this person's life is so impacted by this new friend that he says, I see Jesus, I want Jesus, I want to have him in my life. And so this is what he does. Now his friend realizes something in his life, that he still has some uncharted water to go through. He has a debt back home that still is unpaid. And this friend, rather than just saying, it's okay just hang here, says, I think you have to go back. I think you better go back to the person you owe the money to. At great risk to yourself, because he can enslave you right away again. And so they hatch this plan where this new friend is going to write a letter of reference for this slave to go back home. And they do. And I want to read a part of that first century letter. It's written by a guy by the name of Paul. You'll know that name. He's writing to the slave owner named Philemon, who owns a slave named Onesimus. And this is the letter he writes. He says, Philemon, I didn't want to do anything without your consent. I wanted you to help because you were willing, not because you were forced. It seems you lost Onesimus for a little while so that you could have him back forever. Now get what he says. He is no longer like a slave to you. He's more than a slave. He is a beloved brother, especially to me. Now he will mean much more to you, both as a man and as a brother in the Lord. What Paul does not write back is, Philemon, we're going to work at abolishing slavery in the land. That's what we're going to do. And so just forgive the guy, wipe out the debt, do that. He doesn't actually do that. You know what he says rather? And by the way, when it comes to slavery, when it has been abolished in the world, it has been Christ followers who have led that charge, because it's abhorrent to do something like that to other human beings. But what Paul does is brilliant. He has the courage to provoke Philemon to rethink how he's going to relate to Onesimus when he gets back. And Paul says, yes, he's still your slave, but treat him as a brother. Think of him differently. And Paul provokes Philemon to a different way. Paul is not trying to overtake the cultural practice, as horrible as it is. He's reminding Philemon that Onesimus is firstly a brother in Christ, a creation of God, someone worthy of love, someone worthy of care. And you'll figure out this debt thing probably if you can start with that. Faithful, humble presence within the culture. Rodney Stark has written a great book. I've mentioned it a couple of times. It's called The Rise of Christianity. In it, he looks at the first 300 years of Christianity and how it went from a fringe, mistrusted Jewish sect to a global religious force for God in this world. How the cross went from a symbol of scorn and shame and derision to adorning virtually every building throughout the Roman Empire in just 300 years. How did the culture get so reshaped? By forcing it? By mandating it follow the morals and the ways of Christ? No, that would actually happen at 300 years and beyond by a guy by the name of Constantine, and it didn't work out well. Prior to that, there was no power within the system to do it. You couldn't overtake the culture. So how did this then happen, that we would see this amazing transformation within the culture? Well, it happened by followers of Jesus being humbly courageous and provoking the culture to good by the good they did. You see, they illuminated God's love for people by not fleeing cities gripped by plagues. Instead, they stayed in the cities, contracted the plague themselves, and died alongside those who had the plague for the love of Christ, and changed what the culture thought about Jesus. They elevated the status of women by starting a movement, hashtag whatever. No, they elevated the value of women by loving them as equals in what was a male-dominated culture. They dealt with the epidemic of infanticide by adopting countless children into families who didn't want those children. As hard as it is to think the Christians would go out to the dung heap outside the city where live children would be dropped, and they would bring them home and make them their own. They injected mercy and forgiveness and grace into legal and business practices. And they reshaped the culture, not by withdrawing and not by overtaking it, but by being a faithful, humble presence within it. So, what's the application? Well, I said there wasn't one. I want you to know I think there are risks to do this like this. Bad company really has the potential to corrupt good character. There's risk in remaining silent and not being critical when secular institutions mess stuff up. I know as parents we want to protect our children from the darkness that is within our culture, and it is real. I know there are practices that we simply can't participate in, and it may cost us something to not do that. But I think it is up to all of us, with the help of God's personal Spirit, how we're going to not firstly withdraw or forcibly imprint our values on this culture. So here's the question. It's the one I started with. Would you talk about it? Would you make it a part of your family conversation or conversation with friends? How practically are you and I going to impact our culture without withdrawing from it and without trying to overtake it, but being a humble, faithful presence within it? I think God will help us with that. And I do believe, as much as the church has become marginalized in some way, it is not without hope. It is still the most beautiful, life-giving group of people anywhere on the face of this earth, around this earth, and we're part of that. We just need to think, how are we going to be humble, faithful presence of Jesus in our culture? So I want to pray to that end. Now, Jesus, you modeled this, you lived it, you knew how to do it. Would you simply help us with this? Would we not forget this conversation in this room and go on today or tomorrow and not actually think about it, not actually talk about it? Because it is a really critical thing for us when we think about neighbor love in our culture. To that end, help us. You know exactly how we can best do it in our personal application. And to this end, I pray that you would do that. And we'll thank you for it. Amen. Okay, so practically, we want to live this out in a way. This campus is here to be a facility that represents faithful, humble presence within our community. We're at a place where we need to expand because of some needs that we have and a vision that burns in our heart to be even greater influence for Christ in this community. So, you can see construction has started on our parking lot. This next week or so, it's going to start on the two pads that are directly this way and this one over here. And so we want to dedicate those and what happens on those sites through construction, but all the way through to however long Jesus will let us have influence for him here in this community, and give those back to him and let his influence flow through them. So here's what we're going to do. If you would, as quickly as you can, without stampeding, okay? If you have kids in the kids area, would you go get them right away and then meet us on this property right over here to my right, to your left. And we're going to dedicate that land right there. You're going to be given a shovel, and we'll explain that a little bit. One shovel per family if you can. And we'll go, okay, ready? Go. There you go. Go.